I had lost that medal on the dirtiest, quietest day of my life. But he showed up with it in his pocket, as if he knew. It had no name. It had no record. It didn't speak. But it had my medal. That same one. The one they ripped from me when the sky turned to flame and screamed, when everything that was mine was scattered among the stones, mud, and blood. I remember the weight of it pounding against my chest every time I ran from one wounded man to the next. And I remember the emptiness when I woke, days later, with my lab coat torn and my body throbbing. They said I should have died, and maybe a part of me really did. Because along with the medal, the most complete thing I had was gone. Trust. And now, him. A man no one recognized, no record, no history, but who held that small metal medal like someone holding a secret too big to say out loud. I should have told them this sooner. But how do you tell something you yourself don't understand? Today, with my weary bones and skin as thin as old paper, I just want to say this, before the silence swallows me whole. My name is Margaret Fay Hollister. I'm 89 years old, though sometimes it feels like I've been alive for 120 years. I live alone in an old trailer in the middle of the Nevada desert. The wind here scrapes sand against the windows, and the cacti are the only neighbors who don't complain about the heat. Right now I'm sitting near the open door, my bare feet on the hot floor, and a cup of lukewarm tea in one hand. In the other, a medal, small, worn, with my name engraved on the back. But I wasn't the one who brought it back. For many years I thought I'd lost that medal amidst the chaos. And maybe I did. But it's back. And it's back in the hands of someone who shouldn't even know I existed. A war story no one ever asked me to tell. A true story of this grandmother who doesn't fit on a file, who doesn't fit on a list. But it still pulses in the silence between the seams of my old uniform. It's not easy to remember, but it's harder to hide. So today I'm going to tell it. If you're listening, comment where you're watching from, just so I know how far this story can reach. And if you want to hear more stories from those who survived in silence, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes we don't need to understand everything. We just need to listen, because some things only find a place when spoken in a whisper. I was sent to war in 1943, at the age of 21, my knees shaking in my socks. I volunteered after my father died of grief over losing his brother in France. They said they needed women with a firm hand and silence in their eyes. And I already had that. I ended up being transferred to China, in a medical unit that monitored air operations. It was like living inside an echo chamber, surrounded by a language I didn't understand, but where the pain was universal. The base was scorching hot during the day, and humid enough to make your skin sweat at night. The infirmary was made of patched tarps, dirt floors, and mattresses as thin as folded napkins. American, British, and Chinese soldiers arrived. Some so young they trembled at the sound of pots and pans. The smell was a constant mix of sweat, iodine, and burnt rice. We had 2 rules. Don't ask where they came from, and don't expect them to return. When it rained, a shallow river of mud and blood formed between the stretchers. And yet, I felt useful. I was afraid, of course. But fear grows on us, like a garment that's tight at first, then molds to the body. Back then, I still wore a long braid, hidden under my hat. I still wrote letters to my mother and stitched together words that might hide the truth. I was a nurse who said, "It will pass," even when I knew it wouldn't. I was young. I believed that wrongs had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And today I look at my trembling hand holding this medal that has returned, and I realize that some wounds only heal when we decide to reopen them. There are sounds that make no noise. You only notice them when they've already invaded everything. That day began like that, muffled, thick, as if the sky were holding its breath. I was squatting, cleaning the ankles of a soldier who had arrived with mud-soaked feet and a folded letter in his pocket. It was a hot late morning, the kind of heat that sticks clothes to your skin and slows down time. But something was different. Something in the air seemed denser. The other nurses spoke softly, as if the shadow had fallen before the sun had even moved. My medal hung on my chest, hanging by a thin chain inside my uniform. It was a small aged bronze cross with my name engraved on the back. My mother gave it to me before I shipped out. She said it belonged to her grandmother, who also cared for the sick, but in rural Kansas, where the greatest dangers were fever and botched births. "This will remind you of who you are," she said. I used to clutch it whenever someone died, as if it could keep my heart tied to something good. That morning, however, I forgot to touch it. Maybe because my hand was busy the whole time. Maybe because part of me already knew what was coming. The first noise was like a distant, choked cough coming from the mountains above. We all looked up at the same time. Then came the vibration, as if the ground had a fever. And then, the bang. Not one, but several, one after the other, growing louder. I remember the lantern glass shaking, the IV dripping on the iron stake, and the scream of a young woman. Maybe myself, maybe someone else. The canvas ripped like burning skin. The explosion erupted near the kitchen shack. Smoke rose thick and black, as if God had stubbed out a cigarette right there. We ran. We grabbed whoever we had time for. We dragged half-living, half-loose bodies. The soldier in the letter didn't breathe again. I knelt beside him listening to the sound of something whistling in the sky, like a reminder warning of more to come. That's when I felt someone's hand tugging at my collar. A strong, urgent movement. After that, nothing. A flash. A sharp impact. And a silence that screamed inside me for a long time. I think I passed out there. Or maybe I died a little. When I woke up days later, in a makeshift infirmary smelling of gas and stale water, my chain was broken. And the medal gone. As if it had been taken along with whatever escaped me on that hot floor. I never spoke about it to anyone. They said it was a miracle I survived. But I knew I'd lost something in that bombing that couldn't be seen from the outside. I thought it was just an object. Just metal. Just another piece of me. Ripped away by the war. Until he showed up. Years later. With it in his pocket. As if he'd seen me. As if he'd been there. The ward where they placed me after the explosion didn't seem like a place of care. It felt like a poorly sewn hideout, a pen of stained tarps where the weather didn't penetrate and fear slept on the edges of the stretcher. I lay there for 2 whole days, they said. Or maybe 3. I'm not sure. The voices came as if underwater, and the faces were blurs in aprons. All I remember is a hanging light that swayed in the wind, casting shadows on the ceiling seams, as if someone were writing sentences in the dark. When I managed to get up, the world was spinning, and my legs felt like thin wire. But they wouldn't let me lie down. They were short of hands. And my file, they said, still said, fit for duty. I found that curious. Fit. As if a stamp knew whether or not one's soul was whole. They gave me a new lab coat, too tight around the shoulders, and put me back on the front lines. Only now, in an even worse place, a makeshift wing. Right on the edge of the camp, a shelter of frayed canvas, hastily assembled for cases that couldn't wait. There came the most torn bodies, the most muffled screams, the most empty eyes. It was like cleaning the bottom of a well with your bare hands. The stretchers were wooden planks, supported by bricks. There were no curtains, no privacy, no silence. We could only hear the breathing of the dying mixed with the hot wind and the buzzing of flies. The first time I removed a boy's blanket, I found his name tag attached to his ankle with wire. But no name, just a number. And even that number was crossed out. It gave me chills, as if someone were trying to erase his existence. I started paying more attention. I noticed that some came with nothing. No name tags, no registration, no uniform. Wounded men who looked like they'd fallen through a hole between the sides. Some had Asian features but didn't speak. Others wore American boots, but avoided eye contact. I started calling them the missing, even though they were right there in front of me. They were wounded men who weren't on any list, and the list, in that war, was everything. The list determined who deserved treatment, who could be airlifted, who could die. One night it rained heavily. The wind pulled back one of the tarps and soaked everything. I knelt beside a man bleeding from his nose and ears, and even though I didn't know his name, I sang him a song, the same one my mother used to sing when I had a fever. The rain beat down on my face, mixed with blood, and I held his hand tightly. The next day he was already taken, without warning, without a trace. They didn't even tell me if he survived. I began to understand that some stories didn't want to be remembered. It was in this place, amid tarps, the sound of broken bones, and disappearing papers, that my heart began to harden, and also where I learned that silence was a kind of hiding place, because sometimes telling the truth was more dangerous than living within it. Returning to the post after a bombing was like waking up in a room that no longer recognized you. People greeted you with quick glances, as if confirming you were still breathing, but they avoided asking too many questions. Everyone lost something. Everyone had a sense of silence in their pocket. In my case, that silence was called a medal. The first morning I was sent back to the main ward, I put on my new lab coat and immediately noticed the emptiness. My chest felt lighter, light in the wrong way, as if I'd lost the only piece of me that knew where it was. I ran my hand over the place where it used to beat, right between my ribs, near my heart. Nothing. Not the weight. Not the cold touch of metal. Not the feeling of being anchored to some part of my history. It could have been ripped away in the confusion. It could have been buried under the rubble. But there was something about the way it vanished, as if it had been taken, as if someone had chosen to take it from me. This bothered me more than the head wound, more than the pain in my back. It wasn't just the object. It was what it carried. My name, my lineage, the only thing that reminded me there was life before the war. The medal was the last thing my mother had given me with her own hands before I shipped out. And now, it was off the list too. I began searching in silence. I peered through piles of used lab coats, discreetly asking the other nurses if they'd found anything. No one knew anything. Some didn't even remember I was wearing it. It seemed too small to matter. But to me, it was all that was left of Margaret before the bombing. And she was gone, just like the soldier in the letter. Just like so many other things that vanished without warning in that war. It was around this time that I began writing in a notebook hidden among my medicines. Short sentences, syllables even. As if I could store in them what the world was tearing from me. On one page I wrote, "If she comes back, maybe I will too." And I underlined it with my fingernail covered in dried blood. But the truth is, I no longer believed. Not in the return. Not in us. I thought I'd never see that object again. I thought it had been erased along with the ground from that bombing. I didn't even know it yet. But that medal would still return. Not by the hands of a friend, not by a superior, but by a nameless man. A man who shouldn't have been there. A man who held in his pocket not only my past, but something I didn't have the courage to face. It was a long time later. Years, perhaps. The war still raged elsewhere, but our base had already changed its rhythm. We were in a transit area where the wounded were merely stabilized before being sent to larger hospitals, or where silence awaited them. I had grown accustomed to the lack of the medal. Or at least, that's what I told myself. He still touched his chest from time to time, out of habit. But I no longer expected to find anything there. Just skin. And a quiet emptiness. I was organizing supplies of gauze when a commotion started outside. 2 soldiers were dragging an unconscious man, their uniforms too dirty to tell where they'd come from. His body swayed between them as if weightless. Or soulless. The first thing I noticed was the state of his leg. A deep, poorly stitched wound, already raging with fever. But what caught my attention wasn't the blood. It was the fact that there was no file, no paperwork, no name, no number, no tag, no sign that he existed within the war. And yet, he was there. I asked who it was. The older soldier simply replied, "He needs care. That's all you need to know." The other avoided looking at me. That was strange enough, but on that base, we learned not to question certain silences. I simply wrote it down in my notebook. Unnamed man, 5:45 p.m. I placed him on a stretcher at the back, where the sun wasn't direct and the heat was less intense. His eyes were closed, his lips were dry, and his forehead was burning. I tried to stop the bleeding, prepare an IV, adjust the morphine, but my mind was still fixated on the fact that no one knew who he was. No one was expecting him. He wasn't on any list. And if he's not on the list, he's not part of the war. He's part of the shadow of the war. It was then, as I pulled off his torn shirt, that I heard a metallic sound hit the floor. A small dry click, but it cut through the air like a knife. I bent down calmly, already feeling a shiver run up my spine. And there it was, amidst the dust and bloodstains on the wooden floor. My medal. Dirty, darkened by time. But mine, with my name engraved on the back, now slightly scratched but still legible in the dim afternoon light. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just picked up the object with hands that trembled as much as his. He was still unconscious. His face contorted in an expression that mixed pain with some other emotion I couldn't name. I stayed there for minutes, kneeling beside the bed, staring at the medal, then at him, and then back into the void. It was like seeing a ghost returning something I shouldn't have known, something that had been buried by my silence. I should have called someone. I should have told him, but I didn't. I put the medal in my pocket, and I began to care for that man, as if I were caring for myself. There's no preparation for acknowledging something you've buried within silence. When my fingers touched the metal felt heavier than I remembered. Not because of its physical weight, but because of the time it had carried. It was like holding the past in a solid state. The tip of the cross was chipped, the edges were lightly burned, as if they'd been through the same fire that burned my memories. And yet, the name was still there. Engraved in low relief, in tiny letters I'd asked to have made before boarding, M.F. Hollister. My heart caught in my throat. A buzzing filled my ears. The ground seemed to sink in. That piece of me, which I had thought was missing, was there, on the floor of a ward that didn't exist on any map, taken from the pocket of a nameless man. I sat on the edge of his stretcher, unable to say anything. The wounded man was still unconscious, sweating, mumbling words in a language I didn't understand. But something in the way his face furrowed, the way his chest heaved, told me he knew. He knew about me. He knew about the medal. Or maybe he knew something even deeper, something I didn't want to remember. My hand shook so much I almost dropped the medal again. I placed it on a clean cloth. I tried not to look. I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But the smell of the medal was the same as that of those burned canvases, of the blood-soaked earth after the bombing, of the smoke that stung my eyes when I woke surrounded by silent bodies. It was as if that object had brought the entire day back with me, not as a memory, but as a presence. The smell was warm, raw, almost alive. I spent hours torn between two truths. Either he had seen me that day and recognized me, or he was part of what destroyed me. Both paths hurt, because both implied that something I wanted to forget had been witnessed. Late in the night, when the sounds of the infirmary had faded to nothing but breathing, and the wind outside whistled through the tents, I placed the medal in a small empty bandage box. I hid it under a pile of clean cloths, and I returned to the man. I looked at him as if searching for something familiar, but I found nothing. No anger, no relief, only an inverted mirror of myself. Maybe he was a survivor like me. Maybe he was part of the shadow. Or maybe he was a stranger carrying what was taken from me without ever knowing why. But in that moment, he became more than a patient. He became a secret, breathing beside me. And I knew something inside me had just awakened, and it wouldn't sleep easily anymore. Some memories don't return in images or words, but in smell, and the medal's scent was the most specific of all. It wasn't the simple odor of old metal. It was something else. It was like the breath of war blowing back on my face. As soon as I closed the box where I'd hidden the object, the air around me seemed to change. The same stifling heat from before the bombing filled the ward. The same taste of iron in my mouth. The same cold sweat running down the small of my back. It was as if time had loosened an invisible thread, and now everything was stuck to me again. I smelled the burning stretchers again, the warm blood soaking bandages before they were even opened, the melted leather of the boots, the sweet gunpowder mingling with the bitter smell of burning flesh. That medal carried it all, as if I'd absorbed the exact moment I stopped being a nurse and became a survivor. And that was what paralyzed me. I sat in the corner of the tent, alone, staring at the body of the man who'd brought it back. He was sleeping now, a heavy, dirty, shivering sleep. For a moment, I wished he'd never wake, because if he did, there would be questions. There would be eyes staring back at me. There would be, perhaps, some sentence that would resurrect that day within me. But there was also a different impulse, hidden deep within my ribs. Curiosity. The childish need to ask, why did you bring this? Why me? Why now? But I didn't ask. Not yet. I watched his chest rise and fall. He was younger than he looked from afar. His face was dirty. But it didn't carry the weight of someone in command. It carried the weariness of someone who'd obeyed too much. Maybe that's what confused me. Maybe it was the resemblance to someone I'd seen for a few seconds that day, just before the explosion. A man leaning against the wooden post, his eyes too wide. I don't know. I don't know if it was him, or if my brain was already beginning to sew coincidences with the torn fabric of memory. I grabbed a clean cloth, wet it with cold water, and began to clean his face, slowly, as if cleaning a lost statue, as if washing away time. His eyelashes fluttered, but he didn't open his eyes. He murmured something, and for a second, I swear, it sounded like my name. My whole body shivered. I dropped the cloth into the bucket. I looked back at the box where I'd hidden the medal, and I thought, if he knows who I am, then someone told him, or he saw him, or he was there, maybe closer than I care to remember. I left the tent that night with my eyes burning and my ears filled with static. The Chinese desert outside was silent, but inside me, the bombardment began again. Not with bombs, but with memories. And smell. Always the smell. Doubt didn't arrive as a question. It arrived as a presence, like a shadow glued to my back, walking with me as I handed out syringes, cut bandages, and feigned normalcy among the others. I tried to work, but all the while I heard the unspoken question, what if he was there? Not as someone who arrived later, but as someone who saw, someone who already knew me before I even looked at him. On the third day, he began to truly wake up. He moved his eyes. He tried to sit up. The fever had gone down, but his expression was always the same, tense, cautious, as if he were measuring every movement around him. He never said a word, but his eyes bore into me. They were a dull, ordinary brown, but there was something in the way he watched me, as if I carried something he recognized. It wasn't fear. It was a strange kind of weary recognition. I began to observe him, too. I tried to remember faces from the day of the bombing. There were so many screams, so many faces covered in dust and blood, but there was one in particular that haunted me. A young man with a sweaty face, hunched over next to one of the kitchen structures. I remember seeing him seconds before the first explosion. Our eyes met for a split second. He seemed to be trying to tell me something. Then, everything went up in smoke. Could it be possible? Could it be this man? The coincidences were starting to pile up. The medal, the silence, the lack of a record, the long look, and now the feeling he expected something from me, as if he were testing how much I remembered. One of the nurses asked why I spent so much time with the man on the back gurney. I replied that he needed more observation, but the truth was I couldn't walk away. It was as if that fragile body carried a part of me that I couldn't recover on my own. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was just my mind trying to find logic where there was only pain. I began to dream about him. Confusing dreams. In one, he handed me the medal in a ruined church. In another, he wiped blood from my hands and said my name in my father's voice. I woke up sweaty, my pillow damp. One night, I woke up sitting up with my hands trembling in my lap and realized I had said out loud, "I saw you there, didn't I?" But he didn't answer. Not in his dreams. Not when he was awake. He just looked at me. And that look was worse than any answer, because within it lived the possibility, the suspicion, the threat that my greatest trauma hadn't been invisible. What if he had seen? What if he knew? What if I wasn't as alone that day as I thought? He didn't say a single word, not a single one, even after he was fully awake, even after he could sit up on his own. The base doctor assumed it was some kind of neurological trauma, damage from the leg wound or from the shock. But I sensed it was a choice, that his silence was carefully constructed, as if each spared sound were another brick in the hiding place he carried inside. Every time I entered the tent, his eyes were already waiting for me. He didn't turn away. He didn't pretend to sleep. He stared at me with a calmness that disarmed me. It was as if time stood still between us. I'd ask simple questions. "Are you in pain? Do you want water? Can I change your bandage?" But he'd just nod or move his fingers. There was something rehearsed about it. Something that wasn't just suffering. It was control. As if he knew that every word he spoke could open a path from which there would be no return. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. The medal remained hidden. Each night I removed it from its box and placed it on my palm, as if consulting a silent oracle. The rim was still melted. The name was still there. But now it held something else. His presence. It was as if every time I touched it, I also touched him. That version of him that existed before he was brought onto my stretcher. One morning, as I was changing the bandage on my wound, I noticed his eyes fixed on my identification medal, which I now wore in my outside pants pocket. Not the cross, not the one that had disappeared and returned, but the other, plain one, with my name, rank, and registration number. He was looking at it with an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't surprise, nor fear. It was familiarity, like someone rediscovering an old road, like someone recognizing a letter on the wall. I pressed my lips together and continued working. But he didn't take his eyes off me. When I finished tying the bandage and went to stand up, he grabbed my wrist tightly. For the first time, he made me stop. And then, very slowly, he brought his finger to my name tag and traced it with his fingernail. I didn't say anything. But that was more than any words. It was as if he were saying, I know who you are. I've always known. My breath hitched. His hand was warm, trembling. And he released me slowly, like someone afraid to let go of a secret. I left without a word. And I spent the rest of the afternoon feeling like I'd just heard a silent scream inside my chest. And maybe it did. Because sometimes, someone's silence screams our name louder than any voice. The first spark came from the makeshift stove the nurses used at night behind the tent. It was only for heating water, but that night the wind blew too hard. I was inside, rearranging the morphine vials when I smelled it. A kind of smoke I knew all too well. Burning canvas. I ran outside. A small fire was spreading along the side of the makeshift ward, and part of it had already reached the stretcher where the nameless man slept. The sheet caught fire like stationery. Another nurse and I managed to extinguish the flames before they reached the mattress completely. But the fabric was already almost completely charred. The injured man woke up coughing, startled, and tried to get up. He had to be restrained. The panic in his eyes was disproportionate to the scale of the incident. As if the fire had reignited something he didn't want to return. After calming the situation and making sure no one was hurt, I went to collect what was left of the sheet and the card that was attached to the end of the stretcher. And that's when I noticed. The plug had been changed. It wasn't the same as it had been days before. The paper, which had previously contained medical notes I'd written myself, my tiny, left-slanted handwriting, was now filled with a firm, cold, almost military hand. Standardized data, a false admission date, a vague place of origin, and a made-up name, Jonathan W. Clark. A name so generic it hurt to look at. So generic it seemed like it was asked by someone who didn't want to be found. I stood there, holding the paper still damp with smoke, feeling my stomach turn to stone. Someone had tampered with that file. Someone wanted to create a new story for him. And this only reinforced what I already feared. The man in my tent wasn't just an unlisted casualty. He was someone who shouldn't be remembered, someone the system wanted to hide. I returned to the box where I had hidden my medal. I touched it again, as if needing confirmation that it was still real. The metal was cold, and now even more charged with silence. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind scratched at the windows of my tent, and the smell of burning canvas seemed to cling to my skin. I closed my eyes and saw his gaze, again, staring at me as the flames rose, not in fear, but as if waiting to be discovered. And that's when I asked myself for the first time out loud, did he bring my medal for me, or to remind me of something I wanted to forget? But no one answered. Not him. Not the wind. Only silence, and the burnt file with a name that said nothing. He appeared in the late afternoon, when the desert light begins to paint everything that dirty gold color. I was rearranging metal trays when I felt the air shift. He was one of those men who don't need to be told who they are. Just the rigidity of his shoulders, the cut of his uniform, and the way he looks at everything as if he already knows too much. Tall, firm. He entered the infirmary, as if treading on already conquered ground. He wasn't from our base. I'd never seen him. And yet, everything about him was familiar, in the worst sense of the word. Without even looking at the injured man, he placed a piece of paper on the small table next to the stretcher. A dry, raw piece of paper. No name, no signature, just 2 words written in sharp handwriting. Not on record. And then he looked at me. Not as someone seeking help, but as someone measuring the silence of others. It was at that moment that I understood. The man lying there, the man who arrived with no record, no voice, with my medal in his pocket, was more than a mystery. He was a problem, a glitch in the system, a presence that shouldn't exist. And someone, somewhere, was trying very hard to keep it that way. The officer's visit was brief, cold. No real questions, no human interest. It was as if he had come simply to confirm that I, too, knew about the silence. That I had understood the invisible rules of that game. Care for the body, but not the story. Stem the bleeding, but ask no questions. See? But not testify. When he was gone, the heat inside the tent felt even more stifling. I took the paper and folded it carefully, like someone holding a threatening note. I tucked it away between the pages of my notebook, away from my reports. The handwriting still stung my eyes. It was too neat, too controlled. As if even the lines were ashamed of what they were saying. I returned to the stretcher, where the wounded man was breathing slowly. The bandage on his leg was beginning to loosen. I reattached the bandage, pulling gently, and I thought of everything that silent body now represented. He was no longer just a man. He was a hole within the war, an absence with flesh and bones. And yet, they wanted me to pretend he wasn't there. I remembered the medal, the small, dirty cross that now slept inside an empty morphine packet, hidden behind the medicine cabinets. And there, as I adjusted the charred sheet, I understood that war was also made of this, of wounded who don't count, of names that don't appear, of orders that aren't spoken aloud. But that burn, all the same. That day I didn't fill out any reports, but I wrote with a trembling hand on the last page of my notebook. Now I know. He's not the only one not on the list. There are parts of me that were also removed from it, and maybe that's the worst wound. That night, after the officer left and the last shift ended in silence, I sat on the edge of my camp bed, my body too tired to cry. But there was something inside me that wouldn't stop moving, like a child banging on the furniture in its belly. It was the ancient urge to speak, to share, to hand over to someone this weight that was growing inside me. I grabbed a pen and paper and began writing a letter to my older sister, who lived in Omaha. She was one of those people who knew how to listen even to what wasn't said. I began by telling her about the heat, the wounds that wouldn't heal, the scarce food. But soon the sentences began to slur. My hands lost control, and before I knew it, I was already telling her about the man without a record, about the medal, about the swapped record, about the fear, about the name that wasn't there. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a rant. It was a silent plea for help, an attempt to weave my doubts into words as if by stringing together sentences, I could finally understand what was happening. I wrote that he seemed to know me, that there was something in his eyes that took me back to the day of the bombing, to the moment when everything inside me shattered and disappeared, that maybe, just maybe, he was the only witness to what I experienced when I thought no one saw me. The letter was long, shaky, with crossed-out words and broken passages. I rewrote it twice. I folded it carefully. I wrote my sister's name on the envelope. And then I stopped. I held the envelope between my fingers and realized I couldn't send it. This wasn't just paper. It was a piece of a secret that didn't belong to me alone. And that, if spoken, could burn more than it protected. I walked to the back of the infirmary, where a stove used to boil water stood. The flame was low and steady. I took the envelope from my pocket. I stared at the paper between my fingers, listening for a scream from my conscience. But there was only the sound of cicadas outside and the creak of wood contracting in the heat. I put the letter in the fire. She bent over. She turned gray. And then she was gone. I stood there, staring at the embers, feeling the smell of burning paper mix with my own guilt. That was worse than losing the medal. Because the medal? At least it was back. But that letter could never be rewritten with the same pain. It was a relief and a loss at the same time. Like everything in war. On the way back to my tent, I wrote in my notebook, "There are things that only exist when they are unsaid, and others that begin to hurt when we choose to remain silent." From that night on, I carried the secret alone, and the silence that had once protected me now felt more like a prison. I had the question in my throat every day. It came slowly, in the pauses between dressings, in the early mornings when I collected the used water buckets, or when the wind blew through the canvas of the infirmary, making everything sway like a tired breath. The question grew inside me like an invisible tumor. Were you there that day? Did you see me? But it never came out. I never found the strength or courage to say it out loud, because I knew, deep down, I always knew, that the answer, whatever it was, would change everything. If he said yes, that he saw me at that moment, on the ground, covered in blood, with my clothes torn, and the medal missing from my chest, what would that do to the image I'd built of myself after the war? And if he said no, that he'd never been there, that he'd found the medal by chance, what would that do to my silence, to my secret? Between knowing and not knowing, I chose the latter, because doubt, however painful, was still a kind of protection. Certainty wasn't. Certainty rips off the covers at night. Certainty turns the bed upside down and makes us sleep on the cold floor of truth. And I already knew that kind of cold all too well. The man was still silent. He never spoke, never wrote, never tried to escape. He just looked at me as if he'd already said everything, as if what was between us was greater than any words. I knew that if I asked, he might answer, with a gesture, a look, or even with his voice. But the question never came. One night I sat alone beside him. The rain pattered softly on the canvas, and there was a scent of eucalyptus in the air, wafting from a heating pad on the other side of the tent. I stood there, observing the contours of his face in the light of a small lamp. He had sunburns, subtle scars, and a serenity that belied someone who had lived through what we had. I opened my mouth. I took a deep breath. The silence between us was so thick I could have touched it. But instead of asking, I simply reached out and brushed my hand against his. He didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as if that touch had already said what I feared. It was as if he understood I wasn't ready to hear it. The next morning I wrote in my notebook, "There are questions that shouldn't be asked, because the answer can hurt more than what we tried to forget." And I continued my day, as if there wasn't an abyss inside my chest. It was a muggy afternoon like so many others, but there was something strange in the air, a silence thicker than usual, as if the world outside was holding its breath. The man had slept poorly that night. He moved more than usual, and the bandage on his leg was beginning to come loose at the edges. I grabbed a pair of thin scissors and clean gloves and began the routine procedure of removing the bandage, as I had so many times before. But that day, when I removed the second layer of gauze, I felt resistance, something stiffer between the tissues. It wasn't clotted blood, it was paper, thin, folded. A small brown rectangle, damp at the edges, folded precisely and placed tightly against the skin, as if it had been sewn with the intention of being forgotten, as if it concealed something that could not be lost. My hands froze. Carefully, I slid the note out. I walked over to the small table in the corner of the ward, where the light filtered in through a crack in the canvas, and opened it. The first line was written in Mandarin. I didn't understand it, but the second was my name, written in a shaky, crooked hand, as if someone were writing while moving or in pain. My full name, Margaret Fay Hollister. The note was short. The paper smelled of antiseptic and old damp, but that was enough. Enough to make my skin crawl from my feet to the back of my neck, enough to make my legs tremble. There was no date. There was no signature. Just that language I couldn't read. And below it, my name. Alone, exposed, like a silent call, like a handwritten scream. I immediately closed the note and hid it in the inside pocket of my lab coat, along with the medal, which was still in its envelope. The two objects now seemed to speak to each other, like parts of the same memory trying to emerge. I walked back to the stretcher. The injured man was asleep, but his face was turned toward me. One eye was half closed. I didn't know if he'd seen me, if he knew I'd found him, but his expression was calm. Or maybe relieved. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? I didn't even know what it meant. The paper asked me questions I couldn't answer, and at the same time it told me something with a power only the heart could understand. That night I wrote in my notebook, "Some truths arrive folded, and when they open up they no longer fit in the same place." After that, I tucked the note away in the bottom of a box with another patient's name written on the outside, as if hiding was, once again, the only way to move forward. He was transferred on a gray morning, the kind of morning that doesn't know whether to be day or shadow. There was no advance warning. Just two men arrived silently, with no visible insignia, carrying a folded piece of paper that no one showed me. They walked straight in, without introducing themselves. They didn't say my name. They simply began preparing the patient, as if he were an object to be dispatched, as if he had never been there. I was arranging bottles of ether, trying to pretend this was just like any other moment, but my hands were shaking. I watched from afar, trying to maintain my nurse's posture, but inside, it felt like a string was being pulled from inside my stomach. He didn't react. He let them move him. No gesture, no sound, no look. But before he was placed on the transport stretcher, one of the men accompanying him held out a small cloth for him to hold. And that's when I saw it. The cross, the medal, the same one. He held her for a brief moment, as if holding something too hot. And then he placed her on the stretcher, folding the cloth over her, precisely, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Then he left. I waited for the sound of his footsteps to fade, for the silence to return. Only then did I walk to the stretcher where he had been. The sheet was still crumpled, the mark of his body still warm. I lifted the cloth. The medal was there, burned, one edge more deformed than before, as if it had passed through the same fire that had consumed me in silence. But it was it. Mine. With my name. Now faded, but still there. I held the object carefully, as if it were fragile. But it wasn't. It was heavy, alive, warm. It was a small, crooked mirror of what I had become. A memory that had been taken, distorted, and now returned with a different story. a different skin. There was no note, no gesture, no explanation, just that silent act. Return. And there in that moment I understood. That return wasn't an apology, nor an explanation. It was closure, a final stitch, sewn without a needle, a pact sealed without words. I held the medal in the palm of my hand. I felt the metal warm with the heat of my skin, and I knew, without understanding, that it held something. But it didn't erase it, because some pains return, even when we bury them with ceremony. That night I wrote just one sentence in my notebook, and then closed the pages without rereading them. What was mine is back. But it's not the same anymore. Decades passed. The war became a book, a documentary, a generation's silence. And I, who returned with my body intact but with pieces of my soul missing, tried to carry on. I worked in small clinics. I taught first aid at a school. I aged slowly, sometimes forgetting, sometimes remembering too much. The medal remained in a thick paper envelope, along with some faded photos and notes I never sent, never told, never showed. Until one day, in one of those twists and turns that only life can take, I had to go to a veterans hospital in Reno. It was a routine checkup, blood pressure, heart rate, those things that start to fail as age becomes your identity. The waiting room was nearly empty. Just an old man sitting by the window, skin tanned by the sun, thinning hair, eyes half closed, as if still carrying the light of war within. His name was called by the receptionist. A common name. A name that meant nothing to anyone in that room. But as he stood, bowed slightly, and walked past me, he murmured something low, almost imperceptible, a sound that seemed lost in the air. But I heard. It was my name. Margaret. Nothing more. That's all. No context. No looking. No pause. Like someone delivering a last letter without an envelope. I stood still. The air stopped. The world seemed to choke. I looked around, but no one noticed. He had already disappeared down the hallway. And for some reason, I didn't follow him. I didn't follow. I just held on tightly to the railing and took a deep breath. It could have been a coincidence, a hallucination, or just an echo from the past playing on my already tired ears. But I knew, deep down, I knew. It was him, or someone who knew about me. The hand holding the bag trembled, and for the first time in years, I felt the urge to open the envelope, see the metal, feel its weight. But I didn't. At that moment, it was enough to know that my name still existed somewhere beyond the silence. That night, I wrote in my notebook in the firmest handwriting I could manage, "Someone still remembers," and that is more than many dead people can say. The sky today is the same as it was at the hospital in Reno. Silent, stretched, cloudless, but with the feeling that something is about to happen, even if nothing happens. I'm sitting here, in the same corner of my trailer in Nevada, my bare feet on the worn carpet, my now cold cup of tea beside me. The dust-stained curtains move slightly in the wind, and the cacti outside remain standing, inexplicably standing. I hold the wooden box on my lap, the one where I keep the remains of what I was. Inside it, the thick yellowed paper envelope, and inside it, the metal. Burnt, silent, enduring time better than I could. I take the object off and let it fall onto my hand, where it rests as if I'd just returned from war. Again. I look at the name engraved on the back, almost faded but still there, and I realize it never ceased to exist. Not in the flames, not in that man's pocket, not in the decades I remained silent. Because some names endure even when no one speaks them. I've spent my whole life trying to understand why he brought it back, why that metal, stained with me, with us, was returned by someone who wasn't listed anywhere. And I think I understand now. He didn't just bring an object. He returned what the war tried to erase, what was ripped from me without witness, and now rests on my skin again as a mark, not a scar. For a long time I thought I'd lost the medal in the bombing, that it had been stolen, forgotten, buried among bodies. But the truth is, perhaps it had left me, to find me later, when I was ready, when the silence had taken root enough to blossom. Today I no longer need answers. I never knew his real name. I never will. But he saw me. He saw me when I was just dust on the ground. He saw me when I still thought no one had seen me. And that changes everything. I held this story inside me for so many years that it began to ache like bones on a rainy day. And now, as I tell it, it still hurts. But at least, it pulsates. And that's different. That's life. If you've listened this far, if this story touched some hidden part of you, comment where you're listening from. Sometimes I like to imagine how far my silence can go now that it has a voice. And tell me, honestly, if someone came to you with your pain in their pocket, what would you have done? And now, she's back. But what remained never left the list again.